Welcome back, Psych 100 students, part 2. Here we go. We were talking about the Army Alpha test and the additional controversy. Besides half the men failing the test, realizing something's wrong with this test, right? There was additional controversy because according to the statistics, 47.3% of the men would have been classified as moron, or today intellectually deficient. And then people started looking at the data. Anytime we fill out forms and we provide data, whether it's online or on paper or whatever, sometimes it gets in other people's hands. And so the US government started looking at that data, just like with the census data. They looked at who were Japanese Americans or who had origins of Japan in the census data, which allowed them during World War II to round them up and place them in internment camps, even though they said they would never use that data for such purposes. They did. People started looking, the government, started looking at this data and looking at exactly who was scoring in the moron categories, which groups of immigrants. We are a country of immigrants with the exception of our native people. Which country of immigrants was falling more likely to be in that moron category? And then they started changing immigration policies. Sound familiar? They started determining, you know what? These groups from these particular countries are not scoring very well. So we're going to cut off immigration from those countries or substantially reduce it. And these countries are scoring better, so we're going to increase immigration. So first, got a test that obviously has some problems, probably some built-in bias that's affecting the scores for these men. So much so that if you scored poorly, you would probably be placed in the front lines. If you scored well, you're probably giving an officer training. So not only would the score based on a bias test determine how long you would live, now it's being used for purposes to determine immigration patterns. Who gets into the country, who doesn't get into the country. It wasn't until the mid-1920s that another group of psychologists stood up and said, this is wrong. First, we're using a faulty test. Nearly half the people fail. Second, we're using it for a reason it wasn't even developed for, to determine who gets into the country and who doesn't. How wrong is that? So they scrapped the Army Alpha test and they devised a new test. Now, some of you have had experience with the military and you know that there is testing involved, and hopefully it's a lot better than the test known as the Army Alpha test. So you can see why this chapter is considered one of the most controversial chapters of all time, because of how literally your life could be at stake depending on how well or how poorly you do. So let me test your fried brains and see if you can determine this rate. This is a poor drawing, but you're used to my poor drawings. Which way is the bus going? Is it going to the left? My directions are way off on this camera. Or it's going to the right, depending on your screen. I don't know if I pointed the right way or not. So take a minute and study the drawing of this bus, this very poor bus, and determine which way is it going. Is it going to the right or going to the left? Now, many of you are thinking of complicated issues, saying, well, it's floating in the air, so it's not going anywhere. It's going up, or it's out of gas. It's not going anywhere. But they showed this image to a bunch of third graders, and 90% immediately said it was going to the left. And when asked, they said, because you can't see a door. There's no door there. When I heard that, and believe me, I studied this picture too when I first saw it, I just thought, man, those third graders are smarter than me. They figured out the door's on the other side, so they're going to the left. Kids are so smart. Remember when they developed the Army Beta test for those folks who are non-English speakers? Here's one of the assessments they used to point out what is missing from the picture. So you can see there's more of a connection to the nonverbal abilities. Overall, still didn't really help with the overall scores, right? Most of my students are pretty dismayed when they realize they scored pretty much the same as those men in 1917. And of course, the reason why we scored so poorly, generally speaking, is because of the fact that many of the questions are pretty dated. Unless you're a student of history, specifically from that era, you're not going to really know the answer to many of those questions. Let's test your mental rotation abilities. Take a look at these objects in this particular box, as well as this particular box. Are they the same or are they different? Now, if you have good visual spatial abilities, you'll immediately know the correct answers. In this particular box right here, they are in fact the same. In this picture, they're different. Now, some people can do this instantaneously because they have those skills. For example, I was at Albertsons just the other day, and I saw this guy bagging my groceries, and he was going, putting stuff in my bag, right, very quickly. And I says, man, you're really good at that. And he says, Tetris, man, Tetris. I had no idea what I was talking about, but for you game players, you must know what he was talking about. So, beware of functional fixedness. When you're going to solve a problem, try not to get stuck in one way of solving the problem. Let me give you an example. Let's suppose I want to put one more thing on my wall. But, let's see, I have a little room over here. I could place something over here, and I have a nail, but I lack a hammer. I'm not able to place the nail onto this wall over here to add to my collection of stuff. Now, some of you are thinking, why don't you use your head? Well, that is a possibility. I could use my head to put in the nail, right? Or maybe some of you are suggesting, why don't I just take off my shoe and use my shoe as a hammer? You do not suffer from functional fixedness. I do, because I can only see one function for my shoe or for any other object that could be used for a hammer. I cannot see it as a hammer, whereas you kind of are like MacGyver, if you know who that is, can see multiple functions. Now, we did get a little bit better with our assessment of intelligence. Not great, but better. And that started with Mr. Alfred Binet in 1904. Mr. Binet was working on an assessment testing kids, and he noticed the kids all seemed to get the same question wrong. And he wanted to find out why. What was making these kids get the same question wrong? So he starts developing assessment, eventually became known as the Stanford Binet, to assess both verbal and performance skills. And that's the essence of the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale I mentioned in the first video. This idea of assessment test, which is the most widely used test today, that measures both verbal and performance subtests and skills. So when you take the WAIS, as it's known, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, you're going to get 3 scores. You're going to get a verbal IQ score, a performance IQ score, and a full scale IQ score. And hopefully it's between 90 and 100, which is average, or above. Hopefully it's not below. Going back to that formula I showed you earlier, this is the actual formula to calculate your IQ score. So when you hear people saying so-and-so had an IQ score of 120, this was the formula that was used. And of course, that formula is based on statistics of people, your gender, your age group, and what the normal range should be. Now, we clearly see folks that are well advanced than their actual age. We see those kids that are quite brilliant. A lot of us, when we're put in statistics, would fall within these middle categories right here, right, in the average range. I've tested people in these ranges for IQ scores. I've tested people in these ranges. These were far and few between. Quite a few people I tested were in this range. And one of the things I put in their assessment over and over again was that they had an impoverished educational experience. In other words, they didn't have much formal education, or some of the schools they went to was pretty crappy. Yeah, unfortunately. We see that there are biological differences when it comes to intelligence, right? But this concept of race is a complicated concept for one, right? And second, there's been a lot of controversy when folks have written books, for example, The Bell Curve, which is a publication some years ago, that kind of made an argument that certain races were smarter than other races, which takes us back to that ultimate question: who's deciding the correct answer for a particular question? And could culture play a role? Could it be that the test could be in fact biased, right? Is genetics linked to biology? In other words, if we come from really smart parents, well, we'll be smart. If we come from really not so smart parents, will we not be so smart? Take a look at these statistics right here. If you recall about correlation and a perfect positive correlation, remember not causation, but just a connection. A perfect positive correlation implies the number 1, right? 1.0 is a perfect positive correlation. Every time you study, every time your grades go up. Every time you don't study, every time your grades go down, right? That's a positive, perfect positive correlation if it happened every time. Look at the research here that shows identical twins who are reared together. A 0.86 correlation, which tells us that if your identical twin scores very high on the WACE, you're going to score very high too. If they score poorly, you're most likely to score poorly, even when we raise them apart. It's 0.72, extremely significant. So, the further you get away from biological connection, the less correlation there is. This gives us evidence that, in fact, intelligence is genetically based. Does that mean that if our parents aren't very bright, we have no chance of passing this class or any class? Absolutely not. We see people that come to class, don't study, and they do really well on exams. Just very bright people. They just soak it in and they understand it and they're able to perform on tests. We see other folks that also get A's, but you know what? They work their butt off. That's why you see people walking around campus, no butt. They worked it off. And don't worry, if you have a big butt, you know, it's probably bigger before. You worked off a lot of it because you've been studying really hard. And you have to set up those schedules while you're off and doing it in this particular version. Can the environment play a role in our overall intelligence? You better believe it. How well our mother took care of herself when we were in the womb, what sort of things we've been exposed to since that time, right? And we know environment plays a role in so many different things. But can we overcome these environmental barriers? Well, we're here, aren't we? We're here at an institution of higher learning. I think we must have did something right, or some people helped us along the way. Thank you. To this day, I'm blessed and thank my mother primarily. When she had the 6th grade education, she was scrubbing floors so that I could go to the school called Epiphany, a Catholic school for elementary school, that I didn't know until years later what Epiphany meant, until I had an epiphany on the name Epiphany. And then eventually just encouraged me to go to college, even though she never had the high school experience or the college experience. And many of us have very similar stories. Are there different types of intelligence? The answer to that will follow in the next video. And guess what? I suspect, actually I know for sure, that some of you, if not all of you, have more than one intelligence. That some of you excel in multiple intelligences. So we're going to talk about that next time. I appreciate your attention and can't wait to get together with you again.